The howling wind carried the scent of sage and desperation as Hazel Mitchell stared at the man who was about to become her husband, a stranger twice her age with cold eyes and calloused hands that had never known gentleness. The year was 1879, and in the dusty town of Redemption Creek, Colorado, her father had just sealed her fate with a handshake and a deed to their failing ranch. "You look lovely, daughter," Samuel Mitchell murmured, avoiding her eyes as he straightened his worn Sunday coat. "Mr. Rutherford is a wealthy man. You'll never want for anything." Hazel smoothed the faded blue dress that had once belonged to her mother. At 20 years old, she had dreamed of love, foolish, perhaps, in a place where survival trumped sentiment, but she had dreamed nonetheless. "I want for choice, father," she whispered, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. "Harrison Rutherford is 53 years old. He has buried 2 wives already." Her father's face hardened, and kept them in fine style while they lived. "The drought has taken everything, Hazel. Everything but you. The bank will foreclose next week unless you sell me instead of the cattle," she finished. Samuel flinched. "It's a marriage, not a sale. Mind your tongue before you meet the Reverend." But they both knew the truth. Harrison Rutherford had coveted their land for years, and when drought had weakened them, he had made his offer marriage to Hazel in exchange for settling her father's debts and keeping the ranch in the family name. A business arrangement disguised as matrimony. The small church at the edge of town seemed to shrink as Hazel entered, clutching a bouquet of wilting wildflowers. A dozen curious townsfolk turned to watch her walk toward her future, a future that loomed before her like the shadow of a hangman's noose. Harrison Rutherford stood at the altar, his silver hair slicked back, a satisfied smile on his face as he watched her approach. His eyes moved over her like he was assessing livestock. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, but Hazel heard only the rushing of blood in her ears. She said the words when prompted, her voice hollow. The gold band that slipped onto her finger felt as heavy as a shackle. When Harrison's dry lips pressed against hers to seal their union, she tasted whiskey and triumph. The small reception at the Rutherford estate introduced Hazel to her new home, a sprawling ranch house filled with expensive furnishings that somehow managed to feel cold despite the summer heat. Harrison's hand remained possessively at her waist as he paraded her before the town's elite. "Mrs. Rutherford will make an excellent hostess," he announced to a cluster of businessmen. "Beauty and breeding, gentlemen. All a man could ask for." Later that night, when Harrison claimed his husbandly rights with efficiency and indifference, Hazel stared at the ceiling and silently vowed that though he might own her body, her heart would remain her own. Days bled into weeks. Hazel learned the rhythms of her new life, managing the household staff, organizing Harrison's social calendar, enduring his occasional attentions in the darkened bedroom. She wrote dutiful letters to her father, never mentioning the emptiness that had settled in her chest or how Harrison's temper flared when crossed. The one solace in her gilded cage was writing. Harrison, pleased to show off his beautiful young wife, gifted her a spirited mare named Penny. Each morning, Hazel rode across the vast Rutherford holdings, pushing the boundaries of her prison, finding momentary freedom in the wind against her face. It was during one such ride in late August that fate intervened. Hazel had ventured farther than usual, following a creek that cut through a remote section of the property. The summer heat shimmered across the landscape when she spotted a figure near the water's edge, a man kneeling beside a lame horse. Curiosity drew her closer. The stranger looked up at the sound of Penny's approach, and Hazel found herself staring into the most striking blue eyes she had ever seen. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his worn hat. His voice was deep, with a slight southern drawl that spoke of distant places. "Your horse is injured." Hazel stated the obvious, suddenly self-conscious. The man nodded. "Stepped in a prairie dog hole about a mile back." He stood, revealing his full height, tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and a face that spoke of both hardship and humor. His clothes were dusty from the trail, but there was a dignity in his bearing that caught Hazel's attention. "I'm Jake Callahan," he offered. "Just passing through on my way to Silverton." "Hazel M.I.T. Rutherford," she corrected herself. "This is Rutherford land you're on, Mr. Callahan." Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps. "Apologies for the trespass, Mrs. Rutherford. I was just looking for water before moving on. Hazel studied the horse's swollen fetlock. You won't be moving anywhere with that mount. There's a line cabin about half a mile east of here. You can rest there while your horse recovers. Jake Callahan's eyebrows rose slightly. That's mighty generous of you, considering I'm trespassing. Generosity has nothing to do with it, Hazel replied. I wouldn't leave a man stranded, especially with a storm brewing. She nodded toward the darkening clouds on the horizon. Can you walk that far leading your horse? I've walked farther with worse company, he said with a slight smile that transformed his face. Against her better judgment, Hazel found herself leading this stranger to the cabin. They spoke little during the journey, but she felt his eyes on her more than once. It had been so long since anyone had really looked at her not as property or as a trophy, but as a person. The cabin was simple but sound, a single room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and supplies for ranch hands working the distant pastures. Hazel helped Jake settle his horse in the lean-to before showing him where to find water and provisions. My husband's men check these cabins irregularly, she explained. You should have a few days of peace to let your horse heal. Jake nodded, studying her face. And will you tell your husband about the stranger on his land? The question hung between them. Hazel realized she had no intention of mentioning this encounter to Harrison. It was a small rebellion, harmless yet significant. What my husband doesn't know won't concern him, she said finally. But you should move on as soon as your horse is able. Thunder rumbled in the distance as rain began to fall, pattering against the cabin's roof. Hazel moved toward the door, suddenly aware of the impropriety of her situation. I should return before I'm missed, she said. Jake stepped forward. Thank you, Mrs. Rutherford. Your kindness won't be forgotten. Something in his voice made her pause. It's not kindness, Mr. Callahan. It's common decency. In my experience, he replied, decency isn't all that common. Hazel rode home through the rain, arriving at the main house, soaked to the skin. Harrison was entertaining business associates and barely noticed her appearance, which suited her fine. That night, she found herself thinking of blue eyes and a gentle voice instead of the cold emptiness beside her. 3 days passed before Hazel could return to the line cabin. She told herself she was merely checking if the stranger had moved on, but the flutter in her stomach betrayed a different motivation. Jake Callahan was still there, splitting wood outside the cabin. He looked up at her approach, and the smile that spread across his face sent an unexpected warmth through her. Mrs. Rutherford, he greeted her, setting down his axe. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about me. I was hoping you'd forgotten about my husband's land, she countered, dismounting from Penny. Jake laughed, a rich sound that seemed to brighten the air around them. Your husband has more land than one man needs. I doubt he'd begrudge a traveler a small corner for a few days. You don't know Harrison Rutherford, Hazel said, the lightness leaving her voice. Jake's expression sobered. No, but I know men like him. He gestured toward the cabin. I've made coffee. It's not fancy, but it's hot. Hazel knew she should decline, knew that every minute in this man's company was dangerous not because he posed any threat, but because his presence made her feel something she had no right to feel. Yet she found herself accepting, following him into the cabin. The interior was tidier than she expected. Jake poured coffee into 2 tin cups, gesturing for her to take a seat at the small table. Your horse looks better, she observed, nodding toward the animal visible through the open door. He'll be ready to travel tomorrow, Jake confirmed. I've imposed on your generosity long enough. Hazel sipped the strong coffee. Where will you go? Silverton first. I have business there. After that. He shrugged. The wind takes me where it will. That sounds like freedom, Hazel murmured, unable to keep the longing from her voice. Jake studied her face. It is, but freedom comes with its own price. As does security, she replied. They fell into conversation that flowed as naturally as the creek outside. Jake spoke of his travels, the mountains of Montana, the deserts of Arizona, the coastal towns of California. Hazel found herself sharing memories of her childhood on her father's ranch, dreams she'd once harbored of seeing the world beyond Colorado. What happened to those dreams? Jake asked softly. Hazel stared into her empty cup. Life happened. Drought. Debt. Duty. Duty. Jake repeated, his voice gentle. That's a heavy word for a marriage. Her eyes snapped to his. What do you know of my marriage? Only what I see in your eyes when you speak of your husband, he answered truthfully. And what I hear in Redemption Creek. You've been to town? Alarm colored her voice. Once, for supplies. I keep to myself, but people talk. Harrison Rutherford is a name that comes up often, rarely with affection. Hazel stood abruptly. I should go? This was a mistake. Jake rose, but didn't try to stop her. Hazel, he said, using her given name for the first time. Not all mistakes are regrettable. She paused at the door, not looking back. This one could be dangerous. For both of us. Some dangers are worth facing, he said quietly. Hazel left without responding, but his words followed her all the way home. That night, Harrison announced plans for a grand harvest celebration. We'll invite everyone who matters in the county, he declared over dinner. It's time to remind folks who holds the reins in this territory. Hazel nodded dutifully, her mind elsewhere. Harrison noticed her distraction and frowned. You seem distant lately, wife. I hope you're not falling ill. His concern was for appearance, not for her. Just tired, she assured him. Planning such a gathering will require much preparation. Harrison seemed satisfied with her answer. Indeed, I want everything perfect. The governor himself might attend. As the days passed, Hazel immersed herself in party preparations, using them as an excuse to avoid her husband's bed. She told herself she wouldn't return to the line cabin, wouldn't seek out Jake Callahan again. But fate intervened once more. A week before the harvest celebration, Harrison sent her to town for final arrangements with the caterers and musicians. As Hazel left the general store, a familiar figure appeared across the street, Jake, leading his now-recovered horse. Their eyes met, and the world around them seemed to still. Without thinking, Hazel crossed to him. You're still here, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded. My business in Silverton concluded faster than expected. I found work at the Wilson Ranch for a spell. The Wilson Ranch bordered Rutherford land to the north. Their proximity would be both dangerous and tempting. You should have moved on, Hazel said, even as her heart rejoiced at his presence. Perhaps, Jake agreed, but I found reason to stay a while longer. The look in his eyes left no doubt about that reason. Hazel glanced around nervously. I can't talk here. Harrison has eyes everywhere. Tonight, Jake said, the old oak by Cottonwood Creek. After sunset, every rational thought told Hazel to refuse, to walk away, to protect the fragile security of her life. Instead, she nodded once before hurrying back to her waiting carriage. That evening, she told Harrison she needed to check final details with the housekeeper. Once alone, she slipped out a side door and made her way through the gathering darkness to Cottonwood Creek. Jake was waiting, his figure silhouetted against the starlit sky. When he saw her, his face lit with a smile that made her breath catch. I wasn't sure you'd come, he admitted. Neither was I, Hazel replied honestly. They walked along the creek, speaking in low voices. Jake told her of his life, born in Georgia, orphan young, making his way westward after the war. He'd been a ranch hand, a trail guide, occasionally a lawman when circumstances required. And now, Hazel asked. Now I'm looking for a place that feels like home, he said, his eyes on her face. And do you think you've found it in Redemption Creek? Jake stopped walking. I think home isn't always a place, Hazel. Sometimes it's a feeling, a person. His words hung in the air between them, charged with meaning. Hazel's heart pounded against her ribs. You shouldn't say such things, she whispered. I'm married. To a man who treats you like property, Jake said, his voice hardening. A man who bought you to settle a debt. Hazel flinched. You don't understand. My father would have lost everything. So he sacrificed you instead. Jake's hand reached for hers, warm and gentle. You deserve better, Hazel. You deserve to be loved, not owned. The touch of his fingers against hers sent a current through her body. For one dangerous moment, she imagined leaning into him, feeling his arms around her, his lips on hers. Instead, she pulled away. What I deserve doesn't matter, she said. I made vows. Vows made under duress, Jake argued. Vows to a man who doesn't honor their meaning. There's still vows, Hazel insisted, though her conviction wavered. I should go. Jake didn't try to stop her, but his voice followed her into the darkness. I'll be here, Hazel, when you're ready to choose a different path. The days leading up to the harvest celebration blurred together. Hazel moved through them like a sleepwalker, performing her duties as Harrison's wife while her thoughts remained with Jake. Twice more she met him by the creek, each encounter deepening the connection between them, though they never crossed the line into physical betrayal. On the night of the celebration, the Rutherford Ranch house blazed with light. Carriages filled the circular drive as the county's elite arrived in their finery. Hazel stood beside Harrison at the entrance, greeting guests with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "You've outdone yourself, Mrs. Rutherford," the banker's wife gushed. "Everything is simply magnificent." Hazel accepted the compliment graciously, though Harrison quickly took credit for the grandeur. "Only the best for my friends and associates," he boasted, his hand gripping Hazel's waist possessively. The evening progressed in a haze of forced laughter and meaningless conversation. Hazel played her role perfectly, moving among the guests like a beautiful apparition. It wasn't until the dancing began that she felt a shift in the atmosphere. Jake Callahan stood in the doorway, dressed in clothes finer than she had seen him wear before, not ostentatious, but clean and well-fitting. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and for a moment, Hazel forgot to breathe. "Who invited that cowhand?" Harrison muttered beside her, his voice sharp with disapproval. Before Hazel could respond, Wilson, the neighboring rancher, approached with Jake in tow. "Rutherford, hope you don't mind my bringing my new foreman. Jake Callahan here has been a godsend this past week." Harrison's face tightened into a smile that resembled a grimace. "Of course not, Wilson. Any man of yours is welcome." His eyes narrowed as he assessed Jake. "Though I don't believe we've met, Mr. Callahan." Jake extended his hand. "No, sir, we haven't had the pleasure. I'm new to the territory." Harrison shook his hand briefly. "Indeed. And how are you finding our little corner of Colorado?" "Full of unexpected beauty," Jake replied, his gaze flickering momentarily to Hazel. Harrison didn't miss the look. His fingers dug into Hazel's waist. "My wife has outdone herself with this gathering, hasn't she?" "Mrs. Rutherford clearly has many talents," Jake agreed. "You're a fortunate man." The tension between the two men was palpable. Hazel intervened smoothly. "The musicians are playing a waltz. I believe Mrs. Wilson was hoping for a dance, wasn't she?" Wilson laughed. "She's been pestering me all night, but these old knees aren't what they used to be. Perhaps your foreman could oblige her, Callahan?" Jake bowed slightly. "I'd be honored." He moved away, leaving Hazel with a mixture of relief and disappointment. Throughout the evening, she was acutely aware of his presence, though they didn't speak again. Harrison kept her close, his suspicion aroused. As the celebration wound down, Harrison pulled her aside, his fingers bruising her arm. "That cowboy had his eyes on you all night," he hissed. "Do you know him?" "I've never met him before," Hazel lied, her heart racing. "He works for Wilson." Harrison studied her face. "See that it stays that way. I won't have my wife making eyes at some drifter." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. That night, Harrison's touch was rougher than usual, his possession of her body a crude reminder of his ownership. The following morning, Hazel escaped to the stables as soon as propriety allowed. Her body ached, and her spirit felt crushed beneath the weight of her reality. She was saddling Penny when a stable hand approached. "Mrs. Rutherford?" "Found this caught on the fence. Must have blown there during the party." He handed her a folded paper. Once alone, Hazel opened it to find a message in unfamiliar handwriting. "The old mining shack beyond North Ridge. Noon." She knew the place, an abandoned prospector's cabin well beyond Rutherford land. Going there would be madness. Going there would be freedom. At noon, Hazel secured Penny to a gnarled pine and approached the weathered cabin on foot. Jake emerged from inside, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "You came," he said simply. "I shouldn't have," she replied, but made no move to leave. Jake stepped closer. "Hazel, I can't stop thinking about you. About what your life could be without him." "What life? As a fallen woman? A scandal?" "I made my choice." "No," Jake said firmly. "Your father made a choice. Rutherford made a choice. You were the price they agreed upon." Tears filled Hazel's eyes. "What would you have me do? Run away? Become your, what, mistress? Another man's property?" Jake took her hands in his. "Not property. Never that. My partner. My equal." He paused, his blue eyes intense. "My wife, someday if you wanted that. But on your terms, not anyone else's." "Harrison would never grant me a divorce," Hazel whispered. And even if he did, the scandal would follow me forever. Then we go where scandals don't matter, Jake said. California, Oregon, places where people can start fresh. The possibility hovered before her like a mirage, tantalizing but seemingly impossible to reach. I need time, she finally said. To think. To decide. Jake nodded, though disappointment flickered in his eyes. Time is something I can give you. But Hazel, he hesitated, then continued. Rutherford isn't a patient man. And after last night, he suspects something. What do you mean? I've been asking questions in town. About him. About his previous wives. A chill ran down Hazel's spine. What about them? Jake's expression darkened. The first died of fever after confronting him about another woman. The second fell downstairs after threatening to leave him. He squeezed her hands. I fear for you, Hazel. The revelation shouldn't have shocked her, yet it did. Harrison's occasional cruelty had never extended to outright violence, not yet. But the possibility had always lurked beneath the surface of their marriage. I'll be careful, she promised. Give me 1 week. By then, I'll have my answer. They parted with words unsaid, emotions unexpressed. As Hazel rode back toward the Rutherford ranch, her mind raced with possibilities and fears. Could she really leave everything behind? Could she build a new life with Jake, a life based on choice rather than obligation? The week that followed tested every ounce of Hazel's resolve. Harrison, his suspicions aroused, watched her closely. He questioned her rides, limited her trips to town, and made excuses to keep her at his side during business meetings. Yet, even under his vigilant eye, Hazel managed to make preparations, gathering a small cache of money she had saved from household accounts, secretly packing a bundle of essential belongings. On the 6th day, disaster struck. Harrison entered their bedroom unexpectedly as Hazel was tucking a small portrait of her mother into the bundle hidden beneath their bed. What are you doing? He demanded, his voice dangerously calm. Hazel straightened, her heart pounding. Just tidying some old mementos. Harrison's eyes narrowed. He strode forward, shoving her aside to pull out the carefully wrapped bundle. Clothes, a few personal items, the small amount of money. Her intentions were clear. His face transformed with rage. Planning a trip, were you? Perhaps to meet that cowboy from Wilson's ranch. I don't know what you're talking about, Hazel said, backing away. Harrison advanced on her, the bundle clutched in his fist. Do you think I'm a fool? Do you think I don't have men who tell me things? He threw the bundle at her feet. You were seen. At Cottonwood Creek. At the old mining shack. Hazel's blood ran cold. Harrison, please. His hand struck her face with such force that she stumbled backward against the dresser. You ungrateful whore, he snarled. After everything I've given you. Given me. Hazel touched her stinging cheek, anger rising through her fear. You bought me, Harrison. Like cattle. Like land. His next blow knocked her to the floor. And you are mine, he growled, standing over her. Until death parts us. Remember those vows, wife. Through the ringing in her ears, Hazel heard the threat in his words. She thought of Jake's revelations about Harrison's previous wives, and terror seized her heart. I'm sorry, she whispered, forcing submission into her voice. I was confused. Foolish. It won't happen again. Harrison studied her, contempt mixing with calculation in his eyes. No, it won't, he agreed coldly. Because you won't leave this house without my permission again. And as for your cowboy lover, he smiled, a terrible sight. I've sent men to deliver a message. By morning, he'll be gone from this territory, one way or another. Horror flooded through Hazel. What have you done? What any man would do to protect what's his, Harrison replied. He grabbed her arm, dragging her to her feet. You'll stay in this room until I decide what to do with you. And if you try to leave, I'll have your father's ranch burned to the ground with him in it. He flung her onto the bed, then left, locking the door behind him. Hazel lay there, her face throbbing, her mind racing with fear not for herself, but for Jake. Harrison's men were ruthless, loyal to their employer's money, if not to the man himself. If they found Jake, darkness fell. From her window, Hazel could see riders leaving the ranch for men, heading north toward Wilson's property. She tried the door again, knowing it was futile. The window was her only option, a 30-foot drop to hard ground. Using bedsheets and curtains, Hazel fashioned a crude rope. The makeshift escape route barely reached halfway down, but it was her only chance. She changed into riding clothes, concealed a small knife in her boot, a gift from her father years ago, and began her descent. The last 15 feet she had to drop, landing awkwardly and painfully. But adrenaline pushed her forward. She kept to the shadows, avoiding the main house, making her way to the stables. Getting Penny saddled without alerting the stable hands was nearly impossible, but fortune favored her. The men were playing cards in the tack room, a bottle of whiskey between them. Hazel managed to bridle her mare and lead her quietly away before mounting and spurring the horse toward Wilson's ranch. The night was clear, the moon providing enough light to navigate. Hazel rode hard, praying she wasn't too late. As she approached Wilson's property, gunshots echoed in the distance. Her blood turned to ice. Following the sounds, she veered toward a small cabin near the property's edge, the foreman's quarters. More shots rang out, followed by shouting. Hazel dismounted 100 yards away, approaching on foot through the trees. What she saw made her heart stop. Jake crouched behind an overturned wagon, exchanging gunfire with 3 men who had surrounded the cabin. A 4th man lay motionless nearby. Hazel recognized Harrison's men, the Dawson brothers, and Bill Murphy, notorious for their brutality. They were closing in on Jake's position, their confidence growing as his ammunition dwindled. Without conscious thought, Hazel pulled the knife from her boot. She circled through the trees until she was behind the youngest Dawson. When he backed up near her position, she launched herself forward, pressing the knife against his throat. "Drop your guns," she commanded, her voice steady despite her terror. "All of you." The other men turned, shock registering on their faces at the sight of their boss's wife. "Mrs. Rutherford?" the elder Dawson stammered. "What are you doing here?" "Stopping a murder," she replied coldly. "Drop your weapons, or I swear I'll cut his throat." The young man in her grasp whimpered. "She means it, Frank." Slowly, the men lowered their guns. Jake emerged from behind the wagon, his own pistol trained on them. "Hazel," he breathed, relief and concern mingling in his voice. "Are you all right?" "We need to go," she said urgently. "Now?" "Harrison knows everything." Jake nodded, quickly gathering the discarded weapons. "My horse is out back." The Dawsons and Murphy watched in stunned silence as Jake backed toward Hazel. "What'll we tell Rutherford?" Murphy finally asked. "Tell him I'm no longer his property," Hazel answered. "And if he comes after us, I'll make sure every newspaper from here to Denver knows exactly what kind of man he is." They left the men standing there, bewildered by this turn of events. Jake quickly saddled his horse while Hazel retrieved Penny. Within minutes, they were riding hard toward the west, away from Redemption Creek and Harrison Rutherford. They didn't slow until dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. Finding shelter in a secluded grove, they finally stopped to rest the horses and themselves. Jake examined Hazel's bruised face with gentle fingers. "He did this to you," he said, his voice tight with rage. "It doesn't matter now," Hazel replied, though she couldn't stop her hand from trembling as it touched her swollen cheek. "It matters," Jake insisted. "No man has the right to raise his hand to a woman. Ever." Hazel looked into his eyes, seeing not possession but protection, not ownership but partnership. "Where will we go?" she asked. "West," Jake answered. "To California, like we discussed. I have friends in Sacramento who can help us start fresh." He hesitated. "If that's what you want." "What I want," Hazel said slowly, "is to never be owned again. To make my own choices. To build a life with someone who sees me as an equal." Jake took her hands in his. "That's all I've ever wanted to offer you, Hazel. Not possession freedom. The freedom to choose. Even if that choice isn't me." In answer, Hazel leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with all the emotion they had held back. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "I choose you," Hazel whispered. "Not because I need saving, but because with you, I can save myself." Their journey west was arduous but filled with a growing sense of possibility. They traveled by day and camped by night, selling Hazel's few pieces of jewelry in small towns to fund their passage. Always, they watched for pursuit, but as the miles stretched between them and Redemption Creek, the fear gradually receded. They learned each other slowly, sharing stories beneath starlit skies. Jake spoke of his dreams to build a horse ranch, not an empire like Rutherford's. but a place where quality mattered more than quantity. Hazel revealed her own forgotten aspirations to write, to paint, to create beauty in a world that had shown her mostly hardship. In a small church in Nevada, they exchanged vows that held meaning beyond legal binding. The elderly preacher didn't question their story of lost papers and urgent travel. The simple gold band Jake placed on Hazel's finger felt nothing like the shackle Harrison had given her. This was a symbol of choice, not captivity. 3 months after fleeing Colorado, they arrived in Sacramento. The city bustled with energy and opportunity, far removed from the constraints of Redemption Creek. Jake's friend, a successful merchant named Howard Barnes, welcomed them warmly and helped them navigate their new beginning. With the last of their funds, they purchased a small property outside the city, 10 acres with a modest house and a barn in need of repair. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs. Together, they rebuilt fences, mended the roof, planted a garden. Each nail hammered, each seed sown was an act of creation rather than obligation. Word eventually reached them about Harrison Rutherford. The powerful rancher had filed for divorce on grounds of abandonment and adultery, unwilling to suffer the humiliation of a wife who had fled with another man. The news came as a relief. Hazel was legally free, though in her heart, she had been free from the moment she had chosen her own path. As months turned to years, their small homestead flourished. Jake's expertise with horses attracted clients willing to pay premium prices for well-trained mounts. Hazel discovered a talent for breeding and raising the animals, developing a line known for intelligence and gentle temperament. Together, they built a reputation that brought buyers from as far as San Francisco. On their 3rd anniversary, Jake surprised Hazel with a painting studio built onto the side of their house, a sun-filled space where she could pursue the art she had only dreamed of in Colorado. Her canvases began to sell in Sacramento shops, scenes of wild horses and western landscapes capturing the beauty of their life together. When their daughter was born a year later, a strong-willed girl with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determination, they named her Liberty. Watching Jake cradle their child with reverent hands, Hazel reflected on the journey that had brought them here. She had been forced into one marriage, a transaction between men who valued property above personhood. But she had chosen this life, this love, this family. Jake had shown her that promises could be offerings rather than obligations, gifts freely given, not chains to bind. As twilight settled over their ranch, Hazel joined Jake on the porch, their daughter sleeping peacefully inside. He slipped his arm around her waist, and she leaned into his embrace. "Regrets?" he asked softly, a question he posed on occasion, always with the same answer. Hazel looked out at the land they had nurtured together, then up at the man who had offered her choice when the world had denied it. "Not one," she replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "Every step led me here. To this. To you." Jake smiled against her lips. "To freedom," he murmured. "And to love," Hazel added, her heart full with the promise they had built together, a promise of partnership, of equality, of a life shaped by choice rather than circumstance. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, they remained on the porch, planning tomorrow's work, dreaming of their daughter's future, savoring the quiet joy of a life freely chosen. For Hazel, no mansion in Colorado could compare to this modest home in California, because here, she wasn't owned. Here, she was loved. 5 years later, their ranch had grown to 30 acres. Callahan Horse Farm read the freshly painted sign at the entrance, visible from the main road that connected their property to Sacramento. The business had flourished beyond their expectations, with Jake's reputation for training and Hazel's eye for breeding creating a demand that sometimes outpaced their ability to supply. Liberty, now a spirited 6-year-old, raced across the yard chasing their dog, her laughter carrying on the summer breeze. Behind her toddled 3-year-old Samuel, named for Hazel's father who had passed away the previous winter. The old man had eventually followed them to California, arriving with little more than an apology and a desire to know his grandchildren. Jake, demonstrating the generosity that had first captured Hazel's heart, had welcomed him without reservation. "Mama, look," Liberty called, proudly displaying a small carved horse that one of the ranch hands had made for her. "It looks just like Starfire." Hazel smiled, setting aside the accounts she'd been reviewing. "It certainly does, sweetheart. What a thoughtful gift. From the barn emerged Jake, his shirt dusty from working with a new colt. Even after years together, the sight of him still quickened Hazel's pulse. He'd let his hair grow longer, and streaks of silver had begun to appear at his temples, only adding to his rugged appeal. "Papa!" Samuel abandoned his pursuit of his sister and charged toward Jake, who swept the boy into his arms with practiced ease. "There's my little cowboy," Jake said, tossing him gently into the air. "Have you been helping your mama while I was working?" Samuel nodded solemnly. "I drawed pictures." "Drew pictures," Hazel corrected gently, rising to join them. "And very fine ones they are." Jake leaned down to kiss her, his free arms circling her expanding waistline. Their third child was due in the fall, another blessing neither had anticipated when they'd fled Colorado with nothing but hope and determination. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his eyes scanning her face with the attentiveness that had never diminished. "Wonderful," Hazel replied truthfully, "though your son or daughter seems to be practicing for a career as a dancer." Jake laughed, his hand resting on her belly to feel the baby's movements. Another spirited Callahan. "God help us all." Their moment was interrupted by the arrival of a carriage coming up the drive. Hazel recognized Howard Barnes's conveyance immediately. "We weren't expecting Howard today, were we?" she asked, adjusting her simple dress. Jake shook his head. "No, but he mentioned bringing a potential buyer by sometime this week. This must be them." Howard Barnes had remained a steadfast friend and business ally. As the carriage drew closer, Hazel could see him sitting beside a well-dressed gentleman she didn't recognize. "Children," she called, "go wash up, please. We have visitors." Liberty pouted briefly but obeyed, taking her brother's hand and leading him toward the house. Hazel quickly smoothed her hair, wishing she'd had noticed to change into something more presentable than her everyday work dress. Jake, reading her thoughts as he often did, squeezed her hand. "You look beautiful," he assured her. "Always." Howard's carriage came to a stop, and the merchant descended with his customary enthusiasm. "Jake, Hazel, forgive the unannounced visit. My associate's schedule changed unexpectedly, and I didn't want him to miss the opportunity to see your operation." The gentleman who followed Howard was tall and distinguished, with an Eastern sophistication evident in his tailored suit and careful manner. "James Montgomery." He introduced himself with a slight bow. "From the Boston Courier. Mr. Barnes has been telling me about your extraordinary horses." Jake extended his hand. "Jake Callahan. This is my wife, Hazel. You're a long way from Boston, Mr. Montgomery." "Indeed," Montgomery agreed, shaking Jake's hand firmly. "I'm writing a series of articles on the changing West. The transition from frontier wilderness to civilization, if you will. Howard suggested your establishment as an example of the new entrepreneurial spirit taking hold in California." Hazel felt a surge of pride. Their modest ranch, being recognized as newsworthy by a Boston publication? It seemed impossible. "We'd be honored to show you around," Jake said, his arm sliding naturally around Hazel's waist. "Though I'm not sure we're quite as civilized as Howard might have led you to believe." Montgomery laughed. "Civilization takes many forms, Mr. Callahan. From what I hear, you've created something quite remarkable here." The tour that followed was comprehensive. Jake showed Montgomery their breeding stock, including the prize stallion that had put their farm on the map. Hazel explained their record-keeping system and the careful bloodline management that distinguished their horses from other breeders. Most operations focus solely on speed or strength, she explained as they walked through the paddock where several yearlings grazed. "We believe temperament is equally important. A horse that can't be trusted is dangerous, no matter how fast or strong." Montgomery nodded thoughtfully, jotting notes in a small book. "And you're both equally involved in the business? That's rather unconventional." Jake smiled. "My wife has an eye for horse flesh that surpasses most men I've known. This farm is as much her creation as mine." "More his," Hazel demurred. "I simply help where I can." "She's being modest," Jake insisted. "The Callahan breeding program is entirely Hazel's design. I just train what she produces." Montgomery seemed intrigued by their partnership. "And you came from Colorado, I understand? What brought you to California?" The question hung in the air, touching on history they rarely discussed with strangers. Hazel and Jake exchanged a glance, a silent communication born of years together. A desire for new beginnings, Hazel finally answered. California offered opportunities that weren't available to us in Colorado. And freedom, Jake added quietly, to build something that was truly ours. Montgomery seemed to sense the deeper story but didn't press. Well, you've certainly succeeded. I'd like to feature your farm prominently in my article, if you're amenable. We'd be honored, Jake said. Though I'm not sure Boston readers will find us particularly interesting. On the contrary, Montgomery replied, your story embodies the very essence of the American West reinvention, determination, creating prosperity from raw possibility. He glanced at Hazel, and perhaps breaking a few conventions along the way. That evening, after their guests had departed and the children were asleep, Hazel and Jake sat on their porch swing, watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. The day's unexpected recognition had left them both reflective. Did you ever imagine this? Hazel asked, her head resting on Jake's shoulder. When we left Redemption Creek with nothing but 2 horses and whatever we could carry. Jake's arm tightened around her. I imagined being with you, he said simply. Everything else was just hope. Hazel smiled, remembering those desperate, exhilarating early days of their escape. I was so frightened, she admitted. Not of Harrison or what people would say, but of failing. Of discovering that freedom was more than I could handle. You've never failed at anything you've set your mind to, Jake said, his voice warm with pride. Look at what you've built here. What we've built together. What about you? Hazel asked. Did you get what you hoped for when you rescued that headstrong, bruised woman from a loveless marriage? Jake chuckled, tilting her face up to his. First, you rescued yourself. I just provided the horse. His expression softened. And second, I got far more than I ever dared to hope for. Every day with you is a gift I never take for granted. Hazel leaned up to kiss him, marveling at how his touch still sent shivers through her after all these years. Montgomery called us unconventional, she murmured against his lips. Is that what we are? Jake asked, his fingers threading through her hair. Perhaps. Hazel smiled. Or perhaps we're simply what marriage was always meant to be, a choice freely made, a partnership of equals, a promise based on love rather than obligation. Jake nodded, his eyes reflecting the first stars appearing overhead. A different kind of promise, he agreed. One worth keeping every day. As night settled fully around their home, they remained on the porch, planning and dreaming as they had since those first days on the trail west. The ranch would expand again next spring. Liberty would need a larger pony soon. Samuel was showing interest in drawing, perhaps art lessons in town. Each decision made together, each future imagined as one. This was the life Hazel had never dared to envision in those dark days as Harrison Rutherford's wife, not just freedom from something, but freedom to become, to grow, to love without boundaries or conditions. In the distance, a horse nickered softly from the barn. The sound carried on the night air, a reminder of the creatures that had brought them together, that had carried them to this new life. Hazel closed her eyes, savoring the moment, the weight of Jake's arm around her shoulders, the gentle creak of the porch swing, the scent of summer roses she had planted their first year here. I love you, she whispered, words that had once seemed impossible to speak honestly. Jake's answer came as it always did, steady and true as the man himself. And I love you. Yesterday, today, tomorrow. Simple words, Hazel thought as they finally rose to enter their home. Simple, yet profound in their honesty. Not a business transaction or a social obligation, but a choice renewed each day. A promise freely given and joyfully kept. A different kind of promise altogether.